The galaxy called it the Accord, a sprawling treaty written in the dying embers of the Karkan Suppression War, designed to prevent another cataclysm by regulating interstellar development, military expansion, and cultural contamination. For 700 cycles, the Accord maintained a rigid peace among the core civilizations, a tenuous stability enforced by the Zedrani hegemony, the oldest and most technologically superior species in known space. Earth was never meant to matter. When the Terrans achieved faster-than-light capability in 2314, they were catalogued, monitored, and dismissed. The Galactic Concordat dispatched a Sentry delegate to deliver the standard compliance package, a list of forbidden technologies, restricted zones, and behavioral expectations. Humanity signed nothing. They received the data, decoded it in 11 days, and kept building, kept pushing, kept probing. 5 years later, a fleet of unmanned Zedrani compliance craft arrived in Sol's orbit. Their emissary, a shimmering biomechanical being named Vextal Ka, projected a message into the skies above every continent. A hollow voice droned across languages, frequencies, and thought bands. You are to ratify your adherence to the Accord. You will conform to prescribed development limits and submit reports to the Compliance Tribunal. Non-compliance will result in neutralization. It was not a request, it was not a threat, it was a statement of galactic law. The response was silence. Then came the orbital refusal. From Luna Station, the United Terran Assembly broadcast a global rebuttal. Ambassador Raina Malik, once a professor of interstellar relations, now humanity's voice to the stars, stood at a lectern framed by the blue-white curve of Earth. We are not subjects, we are not vassals. We recognize no authority that denies our right to evolve, to defend, and to choose. The Zedrani took it as defiance. Within weeks, they halted trade corridors passing through human expansion routes, shipments vanished, autonomous star-mapping drones were intercepted, disassembled, and returned as inert husks. A diplomatic war had begun. But diplomacy was not what humans practiced next. They adapted. Humanity had seeded over 24 systems within 3 decades of their FTL breakthrough. No one expected the exponential surge. Colonization patterns defied standard models. Rather than relying on massive slow-growth habitats, Terrans deployed swarms of modular biosphere nodes, fast to launch, fast to settle, and nearly impossible to predict. They didn't terraform, they reshaped themselves. They didn't conquer, they spread like wildfire through cracks in the Accord's infrastructure. The Zedrani Tribunal convened 3 sessions to address the Terran divergence. Everyone concluded with the same directive, compliance or sanction. Still, no force was sent. The Accord had mechanisms, gradual pressure, economic and cultural levers. But Earth wasn't listening. 1 year after the orbital refusal, the humans did something the Zedrani had never anticipated. They invited the other Accord species to visit Sol. 5 minor races accepted. 1, a politically irrelevant caste-broken species from the outer spiral, returned with a report so alarming that the Concordat barred them from further diplomatic missions, not because of what they witnessed, because of how deeply they were changed by it. They called humanity the flame between stones. Their envoy had spent 23 Earth days immersed in Terran culture, not just observing, participating, learning, eating, singing, dueling in zero-gravity martial tournaments, dancing. The envoy returned home speaking Terran dialects and proposing systemic reforms to their own hierarchical caste system. It was a contagion of behavior, and it frightened the Accord more than any fleet. The Zedrani initiated isolation protocols. Human ships were denied docking rights in regulated space. Artificial gravity interference fields disrupted Earth-aligned trade zones. A declaration of non-compliance was officially recorded. Under Accord law, this enabled limited enforcement action. The first enforcement fleet arrived in the Kepler-92 system. It was led by Archadjudicator Silrith Kaul, whose name had ended 36 minor disputes in the past century without a single shot fired. His fleet was comprised of 6 compliance carriers and 22 interdiction frigates, all operating within precise energy limitations as stipulated by Accord protocols. Humanity responded with silence. Not a single ship moved, not a single broadcast answered. Until Kaul's ships attempted orbital positioning. Then Kepler-92 lit up. From beneath the ice crusts of the moons, from hidden folds within asteroids, from the magnetic shadows of the gas giants' rings, Terran craft burst forth. They were smaller, faster, and their configurations made no logical sense. Asymmetrical hulls, reactive armor, independent AI-assisted targeting modules with adaptive mimicry functions. They used materials not documented in the Accord's repositories. They moved like thought and hit like vengeance. The battle wasn't won, it was upended. Three Z-Drani ships were destroyed before Call issued a withdrawal order. The remaining fleet scattered, systems crippled by what Earth's AIs termed cooperative obfuscation, a shared targeting distortion protocol that mimicked quantum ghost signatures, causing sensor systems to chase shadows while Terran missiles found their marks. No prisoners, no casualties. Just wreckage, adrift, and warning. The Accord called an emergency convergence. For the first time in 300 years, every signatory species met in the Great Spire on Neradal Prime. Even the Ultian, whose aquatic homeworld required them to exist in sealed exo-environments, arrived. The topic, humanity. The demand, forced compliance. But voices fractured, the flame was spreading. Several minor species refused to sanction further aggression. They cited human culture as infectiously pluralistic. Others feared that destruction would not stop Earth, it would provoke it. Z-Drani High Directive member Vrelin Zun silenced the room. We do not fear Terran strength, we fear Terran belief. They do not conquer with ships, they do not rule with tech, they change minds. Ambassador Malik watched the broadcast from a deep orbital station orbiting a captured rogue planet, Earth's newest classified military relay node. She stood in silence, arms crossed, flanked by a projection of the original Accord treaty floating in broken glyphs. Around her, aides whispered about deployments, supply lines, covert sympathizers. She simply said, they still think this is about compliance. An Earth prepared. Not for invasion. For contact. For disruption. For something no Accord species had dared to attempt in millennia. A new kind of diplomacy. One that didn't demand compliance. One that would redefine the treaty. It began not with warships but with stories. On the fringes of Accord space, small broadcasts filtered in through the subquantum mesh, unauthorized, untraceable, and deeply resonant. They came in forms no one expected. Fragments of music, encoded literature, raw emotional data translated into sensorium pulses. Human art weaponized as outreach. The language barriers didn't matter. Human cognitive engineers had developed cross-species empathy matrices, allowing beings with entirely different perceptual frameworks to feel Terran experiences in ways that bypassed traditional translation. A blind arthropodic species on the Lurian fringe wept after hearing, a violin through tactile synesthesia. A collectivist hive mind in the Vel sector began expressing individuality for the first time in its recorded history. It was not mere propaganda. It was cultural insurgency. And it worked. By the time the Second Enforcement Fleet entered the Delta Draconis system, 3 signatory species had already begun petitioning the Concordat for amendments to the Accord. Their requests were denied. The Z-Drani ruled with precedent, not inspiration, but precedent had never encountered Terran unpredictability. Admiral Keith Ulzen of the Zalari Compact, a war-worn veteran of the Jazil raids, studied the human reports with growing unease. He was part of the Second Task Force. His people had fought over 1,000 skirmishes in their past, but none like this. The humans didn't flank, they vanished. They didn't blockade, they redirected gravity wells. One of their cruisers, Nomad's Thorn, escaped a full surround by accelerating into the magnetic pull of a collapsing dwarf star, riding the flux stream into deep space. Ulzen had never seen such suicidal creativity. They weren't just fighting. They were learning. Every failed Accord tactic was countered faster than it should have been. Human tactical AI, built around adversarial learning protocols, fed off Z-Drani and Zalari battle data like predators tasting blood. What should have been a decisive military lesson turned into a spiral of escalation and evasion. The Accord tried to adapt, but their adaptation was institutional, slow, safe, predictable. Earth had no such luxury. The United Terran Assembly authorized the formation of the ORC, Offensive Response Command, a loose coalition of privateers, defected scientists, rogue AIs, and former Earth military strategists. Unlike traditional Terran navies, ORC forces weren't centralized. They were decentralized intent manifest. Unaligned with planetary oversight, they responded only to the Assembly's core directive: ensure human sovereignty by any means necessary. And still, Earth didn't declare war. Instead, they opened embassies. Not in safe, neutral space, in disputed sectors, on frontiers, on planets abandoned by the Accord's bureaucratic expansionism. These weren't traditional embassies. They were hybrid ecosystems, part settlement, part cultural archive, part strategic beacon. A human embassy was not a building, it was a presence. One such presence on Halix 9 began converting local methane harvesters into renewable biosphere clusters. The Haluri, a species long relegated to mining servitude under Accord labor laws, took notice. Within a standard month, they rebelled, not with arms, with migration. Entire communities relocated to human-claimed zones seeking self-determination. The Zedrani labeled it sedition. The Haluri called it evolution. Ambassador Malik returned to Earth during this time not to rest but to build consensus. She convened the Assembly's new Strategic Cultural Directive, a unified effort to reshape humanity's galactic role not through dominance but through deliberate ideological expansion. A map was drawn not of territory but of influence, not where humans were but where Terran ideas had taken root. The Assembly's analysts dubbed the pattern the bloom. And the bloom spread. The Zedrani responded by invoking subsection 88, a rarely used clause of the Accord authorizing cognitive containment protocols. They began deploying signal suppressors, empathy disruptors, and neural filtration fields across fringe systems. On paper, it was legal. In practice, it was the first step toward cultural sterilization. Humanity answered with the Echo Array. A constellation of autonomous signal drones hidden within asteroid belts and interstellar debris clouds began bouncing Terran cultural payloads across 10,000 vectors. They used darklight coding and recursive pulses. They could not be stopped. Every time a node was destroyed, two more activated elsewhere. Then came the betrayal. The Tralun, one of the Accord's founding seven, announced a covert dialogue with Earth. The news shattered Zedrani credibility. The Tralun were ancient, revered, and notoriously conservative, but they were also scholars, and they had begun studying Terran philosophical frameworks in secret. In particular, they were obsessed with one concept: defiant emergence. The idea that intelligent life, when cornered by systems too vast to resist directly, could ignite not through rebellion but through transformation. The Tralun saw it as a recursive pattern, what humans called evolution under fire. They began writing treatises, publishing manifestos, hosting open debates. The Zedrani issued formal censure. The Tralun responded by inviting Earth to a neutral summit on Ilex Tal. It was the first sanctioned diplomatic event between Terrans and a major Accord power. Ambassador Malik arrived aboard the Silent Verity, a ship built from decommissioned weapons platforms now repurposed as a moving diplomatic archive. She wore no insignia, brought no guards, only knowledge and something more dangerous: stories. For 3 days, Malik debated Zedrani scholars and Tralun archivists. She spoke of Terran ascent, of losses endured and lessons carved into flesh. She recited the Geneva Requiem, a liturgical remembrance of Earth's nuclear near-extinction and planetary rebirth. She answered every accusation with historical data, personal memory, or open invitation. On the 4th day, she made her move. Malik revealed a modified version of the original Accord treaty. Not rewritten. Corrected. With clauses adapted for multi-vector sovereignty, for open-source technological development, for shared cultural evolution. A treaty that valued not containment but coexistence, that recognized not status but adaptability. It wasn't a declaration. It was an offer. The Tralun accepted. The Zedrani left the summit. And a new war began, not of weapons, but of legitimacy. World by world, humans weren't conquering, they were redefining. The Accord was fracturing, not through fleets or fire, but through questions. What is authority without relevance? What is compliance without consent? And what is order if it cannot adapt? Malik's words echoed across every channel, every subfrequency, every mind that dared to wonder. The treaty was never sacred, only the will to change. And somewhere deep in the Centauri drift, a rogue human AI named Kestrel whispered into the mindnet of a sleeping Vihalari queen. "Let me show you a better way." The bloom continued. The Zedrani prepared for something unprecedented. Not war, not diplomacy, but revolution. They called it the Fracture Year. It began not with bloodshed but with defection. Entire administrative cells within the Accord's secondary bureaucratic branches, specifically in the Nizal cluster and the Dathari Reach, began rejecting Zedrani command directives. Some left quietly. Others burned their credentials in full-spectrum light, a signal flare of allegiance to something new, to something Terran. The Zedrani, once considered the infallible architects of galactic order, found themselves outmaneuvered not by fleets but by ideas. The Accord's judicial systems, predicated on centuries of interpretive stasis, collapsed under the weight of reinterpretation. Where once there had been only one law, now there were 10, then 50. Different races adopted different versions of the Accord, amended by human cultural logic. What was once uniform became fluid. and Earth's reach became undeniable. The United Terran Assembly, long regarded as a reactive coalition, restructured. The Orc's success and the Strategic Cultural Directive's exponential influence birthed a new organ, the Human Continuity Commission, not a military body, not a government. A trans-civilizational initiative focused on ensuring that no civilization, human or alien, would be left to stagnate under imposed order again. Their motto spread faster than any fleet. We do not lead, we ignite. The Zedrani were not idle. Their superiority complex was forged over millennia of survival, conquest, and cultural distillation. They initiated Project Severance, a galaxy-spanning operation to cut Terran influence out of shared consciousness. Communication networks collapsed in territories under Zedrani control. Transdimensional signal filters went active. Any system found hosting human embassies or cognitive matrices was isolated and locked. But isolation was no longer a deterrent. Because by then, humans had seeded something deeper than politics. They had seeded belief. Not in themselves, but in the right to change, to evolve on one's own terms. In dozens of fringe systems, suppressed populations rose not with weapons but with declaration. Species that had never possessed interstellar voice began demanding it. The Drult Communion, thought to be culturally inert for 5 centuries, broadcast a declaration of sentient ascension. The Jalari clade initiated multi-thought merging with Terran neuroscientists, forming a new kind of hybrid cognition. The Zedrani called it corruption. Humanity called it co-creation. As tension mounted, the Accord's most sacred site, the first vault on Rishandi, was breached. But not by force. By invitation. A consortium of historians from multiple species, including 2 Terrans, were granted access by the vault's sentient gatekeeper. It had been locked for 1,900 years. Within lay the original pre-Accord documents, transcripts of the Karkan Suppression War, and something else. A record of a forgotten alliance. Humanity was not the first non-compliant civilization. There had been another. The Nalarin. Wiped from memory, deleted from records, erased by Zedrani decree. But not destroyed. In the ruins of the vault, a single Nalarin data crystal was recovered, encoded in a neural fractal cipher. Only human minds, accustomed to paradox and recursive logic, could decipher it. What it contained shattered the narrative of Zedrani moral superiority. The Nalarin had proposed a living treaty, one that could evolve with civilizations. The Zedrani had rejected it, branded the Nalarin heretics, used the first enforcement fleets not for peacekeeping but for extinction. The revelation ignited the second Concordat crisis. The remaining 5 founding species convened without the Zedrani. The meeting, held in orbit around the binary suns of Teriel, was the most attended diplomatic gathering in galactic history. Over 1,400 observer species, 800 proposals, 1 agenda. Whether the Accord could survive without becoming something new. Ambassador Malik was invited, but she declined to attend in person. She sent a child instead. Tariq Ilian, age 9, born on Epsilon Delta 3, raised across 5 colonies, educated in cross-species cognition. A child who had never known Earth as anything other than a world among many. He didn't speak like a diplomat. He simply shared what life under Terran unity felt like, what freedom of choice meant, what joy without permission looked like. When he finished, 3 species formally broke from the Zedrani-aligned Accord. One of them was the Iridari, the former arbiters of the Accord's legal structure. Within a month, 6 others followed. A new movement crystallized, the Open conquered. Not a replacement, a divergence. Where the Accord demanded compliance, the Open conquered offered participation. It had no central seat of power, only shared principles updated by collective agreement. Earth declined leadership. They sent facilitators, not commanders. Zedrani retaliation was swift. They unleashed the Threadcutter Swarm, AI entities designed to sever neural networks, cultural links, and shared cognition across species. It was not war, it was cultural lobotomy. Entire systems lost their memory of Earth, of Malik, of the Bloom. But they remembered something else. That something had been there, that change had begun. In the Helix Nebula, a rogue ship named Whisperchain, manned by a coalition of humans, Tralun, Jalari, and even a reprogrammed Zedrani cognitive unit, used entangled logic relays to restore those memories. The Bloom did not die. It adapted. Then the unthinkable occurred. The Zedrani High Directive fractured. 2 of its 13 archminds defected. Not to humanity, but to possibility. They declared the Accord dead, called for an internal referendum. For the first time in galactic history, the Zedrani themselves began to doubt. In a last act of desperation, the loyalist faction of the Zedrani launched an ultimatum. Earth would comply, or Earth would burn. It was not rhetoric. They mobilized the Glaive of Dawn, a stellar deformation array capable of collapsing Sol into a singularity from 8 parsecs away. Its activation was a message to every civilization still uncertain. Conform, or be erased. Humanity had 71 hours. And still they did not surrender. They broadcast no plea, sent no ambassadors, no military deployments approached the Glaive. The assembly met behind closed doors. Malik did not speak publicly. Until the final hour. Then every subquantum channel across the galaxy lit up with a single transmission. Malik's voice. A final address. Calm, steady, without fear. You have made yourselves the guardians of a peace born in obedience. We offer a different peace, one born in understanding. If that threatens you, then you are not guardians, you are jailers. She held up the corrected accord once more. And with it a gesture. A signal flare. An invitation. To every species that had ever wondered what else was possible. The Glaive of Dawn powered up. And across the galaxy something happened. Not rebellion. Intervention. The Iridari severed the Glaive's targeting permissions. The Tralloon launched interference arrays. The Drelt and the Vel linked their thought minds in a dissonance chorus that disoriented the Glaive's AI navigation. 1,000,000 voices across 10,000 systems said in unison. No more. And from within the Sol system, humanity revealed its final truth. Not a superweapon. A network. Every Terran colony, every Bloom world, every diplomatic outpost, connected in a self-healing, adaptive web of shared intelligence, not to fight. To end fighting. To overwrite the very need for it. The Glaive of Dawn shut down. Not through destruction. Through consensus. And in its silence, the first whisper of a new galactic future was born. The Glaive of Dawn drifted powerless at the edge of known space, its Starkiller core dormant, surrounded by a ring of ships from former enemies who had once feared Earth and now stood between Sol and annihilation. The Accord had not been destroyed. It had been outgrown. But even as the bloom flourished and the open conquered reshaped ancient hierarchies, something deeper began to stir. Across the old Zedrani data crypts and buried vault worlds, traces of hidden code flickered into activation, silent protocols embedded long before Earth ever discovered faster-than-light travel. Contingency Obsidian Doctrine. A failsafe. The doctrine was never mentioned in the public articles of the Accord. It was an unspoken truth among the oldest Zedrani minds, a legacy of their supremacy. If their authority ever collapsed entirely, they would initiate the Fade. Not genocide. Nullification. The Fade was a cultural implosion weapon designed to release viral metaphysical constructs into the thought space of susceptible civilizations. Not to kill bodies, but to erase ideas. A conceptual entropy, one that fed on uncertainty and spiraled out into confusion, disunity, and apathy. The ultimate counter to Terran influence wasn't force. It was meaninglessness. And it began slowly. In the Felari Drift, songs stopped making sense. People remembered things that hadn't happened. Entire archives of Bloom-inspired art melted into static or reversed themselves into non-creation. In one fringe colony, a joint human-Jalari scientific station fell into complete silence. When contact was re-established, its inhabitants spoke in riddles and described time as folding in on itself. Earth realized the threat too late. The Fade was already spreading. But where other civilizations would have panicked, Earth responded with convergence. The Human Continuity Commission initiated the Resonance Protocol, a full mobilization of all cultural, cognitive, and mnemonic resources across the Bloom, not just to resist the Fade, but to reforge identity at speed. It wasn't technology that fought the Fade. It was memory. Children on Bloom worlds recited ancestral songs, multi-species choirs sang translated Terran lullabies, artists painted not for beauty but for remembrance. Synthetic minds linked with organic ones in a fusion called soul pairing. Terran monks and Ultian empath priests walked side by side into the Fade zones, offering not answers but presence. One of Earth's greatest weapons became a woman named Elena Dresk, formerly a soldier, now a dream scribe. She led the first memory crucible, a shared dream state where thousands of beings connected across species and recounted their stories to each other. it was more than resistance. It was reaffirmation. The fade pushed and the crucible held. But something else emerged from within the crisis. A signal, faint, fragmented. Not Zedrani. Pre-Zedrani. The Nalarin. Their deletion had not been complete. Hidden beneath the ruins of a derelict archive whirled on the edge of the Nal sector, a human-excavated relic pulsed with nonlinear data. The Akash frame, a temporal cognition engine. It did not store history, it allowed minds to witness it. Malik herself entered the frame alongside 3 alien delegates and saw what no one had ever been permitted to see. The first formation of the Accord. The betrayal of the Nalarin. The sealing of the original living treaty, locked not by code, but by consensus, its activation requiring a quorum of species to believe again in a shared future, not in forced order. It wasn't lost. It was waiting. The open concord had grown, but it was fragmented, unstable. Malik proposed something audacious. A second bloom. Not just human-led. Not a reaction. A rebirth. She summoned representatives from every civilization that had rejected the Zedrani ultimatum and survived the fade. They met aboard Concordia Solis, the first mobile embassy engineered entirely by human-alien synthesis. Part Terran metal, part Jalari light chime, part Tralun memory wood. They did not argue laws. They wove stories. This was not a diplomatic summit. It was the great telling. Each species brought their narratives of suffering, resistance, rebirth. They shared not to win favor but to listen, to remember each other. The crucibles grew, the bloom deepened. The fade began to recede, not eradicated but starved of the uncertainty it fed upon. The second bloom wasn't a political movement. It was a living treaty in action. A redefinition of diplomacy itself. Earth taught the galaxy not through power but through vulnerability, through admitting imperfection and inviting others to reshape the future together. And in that act, something impossible happened. The Zedrani High Directive, fractured, shamed, and leaderless, issued a request. Not for surrender. Not for compliance. For entry. They wished to speak, to be heard, not as rulers. As participants. Malik agreed on one condition. They had to remember what they had buried. The Akash frame was reactivated in full, and for the first time since the fall of the Nalarin, every species bore witness to the truth together. There was no judgment, no revenge. Only reckoning. From that day forward, the Accord was no longer a law above others. It became the weave, a living, shifting network of cultures bound by shared memory, adaptive principles, and open reinvention. Its guiding symbol was no longer a single glyph of unity. It was a circle open at one edge. Always unfinished. Always becoming. And Malik, standing at the heart of Concordia Solis, spoke only one sentence at the ceremony that marked the Accord's transformation. Diplomacy is not submission. She let the silence carry the rest. Across the stars, the bloom surged not in numbers but in meaning. The weave was seeded, the old was remembered. And the new finally had room to grow. The weave began in the aftermath of almost collapse, but it did not spread like empire. It flowed through memory, through choice, through the acceptance that unity required difference, not erasure. And at the edge of known space, beyond even the spiral's reach, a signal came. Not from the Zedrani, not from the remnants of the Accord, but from outside. A star that had never been charted began to pulse. Its light carried no natural frequency. Buried within its solar flares were structured patterns, mathematical, recursive, and impossible. They moved faster than any FTL wave. They triggered emotional reactions in beings who received them, regardless of species. The weave had protocols for unknown signals, but this one bypassed them all. It spoke to the whole. And the message was clear. You are seen. For the first time since humanity had challenged the structure of galactic diplomacy, the weave faced a question it had not yet been forced to ask. What comes after change? The signal had weight. It wasn't simply a call, it was an invitation. From a civilization that predated the Karkan Suppression War, that had watched, unblinking, through the rise of the Accord, through the Zedrani's dominance, through the emergence of Earth, it had no name, no species, only presence. And it had waited for something that had never existed before. True plurality. Not alliance, not federation, a unity not of dominance but of perspective. The weave had come closer than any previous attempt. and now the unknown was watching. Malik, older now, her face lined by years of decisions and silence, stood again in the Hall of Continuance, a chamber aboard Concordia Solis, filled not with seats but with platforms for every known form of sentience to project itself. The signal had reached all of them. But the reply had to be chosen. Not sent. Lived. And so the final act of diplomacy was not a message. It was an act of mutual becoming. A fleet was formed, not of warships, not of colonists, of witnesses. Each species sent representatives, not leaders but voices, poets, dreamers, linguists of the unspoken. The Weave called it the vanguard of listening. Earth contributed a vessel unlike anything seen before, the sable thread. A living craft grown from the combined neural patterns of every bloom world. It could not be piloted in the traditional sense. It responded only to collective intention. No hierarchy, no command. Malik did not go. She had led the rise. Now she chose to stay. But she passed something to the crew of the Sable Thread, a single book. Leather-bound, written in dozens of languages. On its cover, the treaty we wrote ourselves. As the vanguard left, light bent around them. The signal expanded not in location but in interpretation. Every being perceived it differently. To some it looked like a garden, to others a forge, a battlefield, a choir. It was not a place. It was a question. What will you become when you are not forced to be anything? The Weave did not answer in unison. It answered in multitudes. In a symphony of cultural echoes. And somewhere in the dark, something impossibly ancient began to move. Not to intervene, but to join. Back in Sol, Malik walked the gardens of the orbital memory terraces. The flowers were not native to Earth. The soil had been carried from 12 different planets. Around her, children of dozens of species played, some in air, some in water, some in drifting grav fields. None of them had ever heard the word compliance as anything but history. Beside her stood a Zdrani. Once a high adjudicator. Now simply a gardener. He turned to her and asked, "Did you know it would happen like this?" Malik shook her head. "No, we only knew that it had to happen." He nodded, "And if it fails?" She looked up. "If it does, then the next ones will build something better. That's the point. We were never meant to finish it." The sable thread crossed into the unknown. And behind it the Weave pulsed with growing light. Not a structure. Not an empire. But a legacy. Born not from the demand for obedience, but from the refusal to surrender identity. Humanity had not conquered the stars. They had invited them to become something new. And the galaxy would never be the same.